More especially those that have joined us online, or rather, not to exclude those that have joined us online. Maybe the best place to start is actually to say welcome to the Africa's leading school of governance. We are actually been having the election series. This is probably our third week running. And the idea was actually to bring in different party leaders. And I note that tomorrow we're actually going to host the president. And today, however, we have actually probably the most important discussion. And I hope it sets the pace for us to go beyond just discussing the issue of gender. It has been an important one, to which we could also add the idea of actually how do we reverse some of the inequalities. We started off by hosting the IEC chair, Mr. Musoto, and we actually had a very good conversation, which was facilitated by Prof. Adebayo. This session, as I've mentioned, is actually on gender. My idea here is to introduce everyone, rather than actually to bore you, but just a few things that I need to say. For this year, we actually have 50 countries involving almost 4 million people from India to the United States, Namibia, Ghana, as well as South Africa, to mention but a few, that are actually voting this year. So it is quite a unique year. The elections, however, come at a time when we are actually having domestic as well as global complex problems. And that's actually my other hat, complexity. And it's a season of crisis after crisis. And I think what has happened is that we're now having reemergence of all the issues that we thought we had actually put behind us. And we actually start thinking that maybe we now reversed back to the almost post-1945 era. However, let's look positive. And I think my idea here is, number one, to welcome our guests. And I'll begin with, it's always nice to actually have our former students move from the classroom to actually come on the panel. And I'm actually referring to Dr. Mooketsane. Dr. Mooketsane is a senior lecturer in political and administrative studies at the Department of Botswana. She teaches public administration and public policy. But of importance is that she's a gender and governance expert with over 10 years of experience in research, teaching, consultancy. I thought I would leave out this part, but I think this is the most important from her bio. She holds a PhD in public and development management. I don't know, colleagues, if you've noticed that every panel we've had, there's one person that has graduated from our school. We should be pointing out those particular aspects. But I think it's only fair that I continue and say that she's also got a Master of Philosophy in Public Policy and Administration from the University of Cape Town. Then I'm going to move on to Dr. Tendai Murisa. Dr. Tendai Murisa is a development practitioner and research in the area of pro-poor development across Africa. Tendai's work focuses on reframing thoughts and bringing new ideas around citizens' agency and solidarity, public policy, citizens and civil society, social entrepreneurship, financial inclusion, as well as land and agrarian reforms in Africa. Well, welcome, Dr. Murisa. It's not always that you actually get to introduce a vice-chancellor, and it's of great pleasure to me that, A, she made it, and you don't have to worry, we've already told her that she can't live with any of our academic staff. Professor Puleng is a South African of Lesotho and South African descent. She's a trained feminist with a PhD in social ethics. She has published widely in the intersection of ethics, economy, and ecology, especially thematic areas of feminist social theory, ecology, economics, justice, and Ubuntu. More importantly, in January 2021, she became the first woman principal and vice-chancellor in the 148 years of the University of South Africa existence, and the third Black vice-chancellor since the advent of democracy. Last but not least, and I think this is where I also hand over, I would like to introduce our colleague, Hlengiwe, Dr. Ndlovu, who is actually going to facilitate this discussion. Dr. Ndlovu, thank you.
Thank you so much. That's Professor Ndlovu. He's our academic director here at the school. And welcome to our guests. It's such a great honor to have them here honoring our invitation for this most important dialogue. And we would like to welcome everyone who's sitting in the room and our audience online to this most important session. Because I think even Prof Bio, as one of the organizers, will agree with me that this is one of the most important sessions within the series that we are running. So today's conversation is around gender and its place in politics and also broader societal structures. And this is us reflecting in light of the 2024 national elections and what it means to be situated within this space. So we know that globally, gender representation and gender transformation is quite a big problem as we continue to battle with structures of systemic marginalization and the deliberate and intentional erasure of women and other non-binary folks from the broader politics and other spaces of participation. And we know that as we are looking forward to the elections, I know most people have read the election manifestos and what our political leaders are actually promising, but we haven't really seen much around what are the practicalities in terms of implementing some of those things that they've been promising around gender transformation, representation and equity. Yet we know when we look around that even women remain the largest constituency of every country. But globally, again, women are not yet accepted within these structures of governance or leadership. If we recall Hillary Clinton's race in 2016 for the presidency, she had to lose, the presidential candidacy to someone else who is a far rights person, because when you read some of the social media platforms, it was clear that America itself was not ready to support a woman, for presidents. And just here home in Malawi, I think Her Excellency former President Joyce Banda becomes one of the presidents who has served the shortest term in office because of the backlash. Back at home in 2017, I think we all witnessed Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma's race as a presidential candidate. And we saw that much of the backlash and how even the media framed the narrative around her, it was not about some of the things that she had done, but it was more aligned to what the former president, Jacob Zuma, who is even an ex-husband, had done. So we did not get an opportunity to learn about some of her strides that she has done in the context. For instance, I think each and every one of us here who's been to the Home Affairs to deal with the issuing of IDs, passports, we can all agree that she has done really incredible work around that space, but we've never gotten to hear about that. Her role within the African Union and other, spaces where she has, made significant contribution, they got to be erased. And what we only read is how she is a potentially corrupt person in relation to a man. So that tells us that we are not ready as citizens of the global village to kind of accept women. Even within spaces in the corporate government and higher education sectors, we still see the marginalization of women and non-binary folks in terms of representation, yet we remain the majority. And the question is, how do we think through transformation? And I know Dr. Murisa would agree with me here that probably within the civic sector is where we are seeing more and more women, because that is where the work of reproductive labor, where the work of women actually doing care work is mostly, confined, and we are most likely to see more women occupying leadership positions there. But where there is actual political transformation, important decisions to be made about society, about the direction of the world in itself, not even the country, we haven't seen women being prioritized in that space. And in some other countries, people of the members of the LGBTQAIA+ community are still experiencing, some backlash. And today we're opening up a conversation to say, how are we thinking about those things and what do they mean in terms of our 2024 local national government election. And I'm going to throw the questions back to our panelists to spark a conversation. And please do join us in the conversation. We are not having a monologue amongst ourselves here, but we want to engage with you. So starting with you, Dr. Murisa, I want to ask a question, and also this goes to all the panelists around the political representation in SADC in South Africa, considering some of the things that I've already said, to think about your own take of the gender transformation project, questions of representation, and some of the things that we've seen within the space related to the silencing and erasure of women and non-binary folks within societies. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Hlengiwe. And thank you so much for inviting me to the organizers. Hlengiwe, it's an interesting question because I think Southern Africa, SADC as a region, we are one of the very few sub-regions that came up with a very clear protocol on gender and women's representation. The aspiration being to make sure that we've got at least 50% representation. And for the past electoral cycle in South Africa, it was a bright star. I think 41 or 42%. That's what was achieved. But I think the discussion, like you said, is an important conversation. I think if we really were to measure based on those metrics, we may tick the boxes that we're doing well. But I think there are important conversations or questions that we have to ask. So what if we've achieved this kind of representation? So I think going back to your question, your framing to say this is an important conversation, I think it's an important conversation because we're at the moment, like Prof said, of uncertainty and crisis. And the crisis that we face is a crisis of reproduction. It's a crisis of being able to achieve the same sort of level of material progress that we envisage for the next generation. So there are many challenges that we are facing despite achieving maybe gender parity in terms of number of representation. So we're dealing with a crisis of rural livelihoods, climate change, etc. It affects women. We're dealing with this country is exceptional in the amount of violence meted against women, the girl child, women, in terms of your rape statistics, the violence, etc. So how does that relate with the numbers that we have in parliament? This country is yet to resolve questions to do with service delivery. How then do those questions of service delivery relate with the numbers that we have? So I think we are at a place whereby in terms of protocols, frameworks, etc., as the continent, we have advanced in terms of providing guidelines. The challenge is just not now to begin to say, how do we convert gender parity in parliament to be meaningful? So as an outsider looking at South Africa, I salute proportional representation because what it does, it gives an opportunity for political parties, smaller ones, to be in parliament. But it creates a challenge because those who are brought by the political party on the basis of proportional representation are more aligned, or they are most likely going to support or to present the party's position. We are not directly electing representatives into parliament. So when we talk about women who are in parliament right now, the extent to which they are linked to the grassroots struggle of women in the rural areas, in the townships, etc., we may find that there is a challenge there. So if I use the country of my birth, Zimbabwe, when I look at it, we have a direct approach to this. Women are part of a political party. They are chosen within the political party through primaries. Then they are also elected as representatives of political parties. But the danger is, given the manner in which it's direct competition, you tend to fluctuate in terms of the numbers in parliament. So I think the tension that we have right now is to say, we can see the benefits of proportional representation, but we also see its challenges in terms of saying, how linked are these women to the issues, these women representatives that we have, to the issues on the ground. So I think it's a tension that we are all struggling with within the SADC region, because potentially it gives us best practice when we're just looking at numbers, but when we're looking at the advancement or the alignment of political party agendas in terms of policies and resource allocations, the fate of women has not vastly improved.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murisa, for that. And this is coming to you, Prof. And I'm not going to summarize what Dr. Murisa said, but I want to pick up the conversation from the question of representation, and in terms of the quota systems and the numbers that we've been counting. I know that we emerged from the ANC conference recently when they were celebrating having 2 deputy secretary women. Where are women today? Are we even seeing transformation? Are these ticking boxes, translating to what is supposed to be? Are the experiences even of women like you within leadership positions really speaking to the actual challenges and even the support from the broader structures that are claiming to be transformative?
Thank you very much. I have a little bit of a cold, so I apologize if you cannot hear me. Can you hear my mic? Oh. Thank you. I had forgotten this administrative problem. Thank you very much. I want to also extend my appreciation for being invited here. I think this is quite exciting. It's not often that we in administrative leadership are given opportunities to engage, and I'm very, very honored to have been invited. Let me start by saying I truly concur with what Tendai has said. And perhaps the question that we should pose is whether the question is about representation or participation, and whether we create a disjuncture between the two or we converge the two. It is my contention that because we often speak about representation. It is seen as a theater for projecting women, but never for really asking the questions around the logics, the grammar, the philosophies, and the commitment they have to the political system as a system of distribution, of resources, of power, of decision-making systems, but also of creating policies and laws or legislation that undergirds the quality of the democratic dividend. And therefore, I don't believe in the question of representation without anchoring representation with a philosophical and commitment towards feminist agenda, the commitment to ensuring that the participation of women and men, or those who define themselves outside that the binaries of male, female, project for themselves. I want to think about, for instance, South Africa, the last elections, when Helen Zille, the leader of the Democratic Alliance in Cape Town, appointed all-male cabinet. And therefore, to put a woman for the benefit of representation without the grammar of change, without a feminist consciousness around the participation of women, or without even the understanding of the intersections of gender, of class, of the history of our country and continent, of colonialism, of the imperative to transforming some of the legacies of apartheid, which are still embedded, even as we think about the democratic dividend, become a case in point that you don't just need women to constitute 44% of the parliament here in South Africa. You need women who are conscientious around the socio-political, economic, ecological, and educational needs of the country as we do of the continent and the contribution therein required. The second, we need to ensure that the political participation of women is also undergirded by the commitments not just to representing women's issues or men's issues in that polarity, but to look at what are the macro issues that have to be attended to so that this participation is not just a micro theatrics, but it really means that transformation. So for instance, our budgets and budgeting systems, many feminists have been advocating for gender sensitivity in the budget allocations. Here at home, we find, here at home but elsewhere, the defense budget being larger than budgets on social security, on education, on health systems, and therefore that already at a macro level disadvantages a fair and equitable distribution of power. It disadvantages the allocation of resources, systems, and services fairly to men and women. And therefore, I think it is also in the space of the law, in the space of policies, but also in the place of political consciousness that the transformation and gender participation may make an indelible mark and difference in our society. Lastly, it is very easy to parrot women and say, oh, she's the first woman, and not put enabling environments or architectures of politics or of economics that enable them to changing and transforming the democratic systems, whether in political parties. Let's take in the economic freedom fighters, for instance. So there was this question around councillors of the economic freedom fighters having to participate or contribute to something in parliament. There were those who did not participate. And Naledi Chirwa, one of the leading Fees Must Fall students, was one of those who did not attend. And the requisite, as I understand, was that they should apologize for not being present when an important decision in Parliament was being made. She had to apologize for taking care of her children, that care work, that idea of being a parent. She had to apologize for that. In a youthful political party that you'd have anticipated, because it has projected itself as central to transforming society, to transforming the political landscape. You really then see that perhaps we're not doing well by agitating for gender. Perhaps we need to agitate for a feminist approach which is attentive to these power inconsistencies, power dynamics, and which is unapologetically committed to ensuring that women are empowered to lead and to lead all the sectors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for those reflections. And it's so interesting that you are picking on the Naledi Chura issue. So I think about 2 weeks back, the CIC of the EFF was here, and those were one of the questions that he was asked in the room. And his response was so amazing that they do not see, the structural divisions within the society. Leaders are leaders, whether you're a woman or a man. We are all equal, and we are supposed to act accordingly. But I want to turn the question to you, Dr. Mooketsane. And this is you really, coming from the country next door, coming from Botswana, and within the space of the higher education to reflect on some of the questions that we are discussing in terms of your own understanding of what would transformation look like in your own eyes. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that question, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be back here, of course, under different circumstances. And thank you very much. I really enjoyed the background that you laid that highlighted how marginalized women are across the continent and globally, really. And for me, what really comes out and what I think we should foreground this conversation on is the issue of difference. I was equally appalled when I heard the CIC say they don't see gender, they see a politician. And I thought for this conversation, it would be really important to start off with the consideration that men and women are different. Biologically, we're different. Socially, we're socialized differently. Our views of the world, the way we view and experience the world is completely different. And so our lived experiences are equally different. And when we're talking about public policy, decision-making, and talking about elections, issues of governance, that is key. So the fact that we're different is critical. So I think it's important for us to start this conversation. I know it's something that we usually want to take for granted and look at as though it doesn't matter. So I think we need to start this conversation from that place of saying it does matter that I am a woman. And it does matter that I need to be the one speaking on my own behalf. I mean, I don't believe that a man would understand my experiences, my challenges, my interests, my needs as a woman, as I would myself. So I think it's quite important to bring that forward. And of course, now moving towards elections, it's quite a critical time for us to reflect as a country and as a continent on where women are and on where we want women to go and what it's going to take for us to get there. And I think, I hope this conversation will help us engage on some of these things. We cannot claim to be democracies, or we cannot claim to be a democracy if women are left behind. We cannot be claimed to be democratic if we still expect men to speak on behalf of women. So I think a lot of work still needs to be done to enable women to speak for themselves, and also for the realities of women really to be expressed and addressed. I think issues of inclusion, equality are critical to modern day governance. Yeah, so I think it's an important topic and it's very timely.
Yeah.
Maybe I should ask a question.
Yes.
This is the admin. I have to. I'm wondering, Dr. Mooketsane. I think our biological, who we are biologically, is quite important. But I wonder if that becomes the locus of our articulation around the only. I'm not saying maybe the substantive, because we are more than just our biologists. I'm wondering if that would not lead us to biological essentialism that then grounds the reasons why we shouldn't be participating, that is used and abused to undermine the roles that women should be playing in transforming political parties, political systems, policy systems, laws, or even just ideas as undergirding the democratic systems or dividend. I even as a feminist, I think if we fall into the trap of biological essentialism, and I'm not saying that's what you're doing, it may actually undermine the very integrity of what we are advocating for. Taking cognizance of the fact that here in South Africa, your gender, your biology has been used to actually advance that marginalization. So I'm wondering, how do we theorize beyond these binaries that sometimes create caricatures instead of propelling us to thinking around strengthening, transforming, especially taking into context the patriarchal definition of a woman. It's one who procreates. You're not supposed to have sex for the enjoyment of it. It has to be children. I'm just giving an example. It's just an easy example. You're not supposed to be a leader, whether of a political party or system, because you might fall pregnant and therefore take 9 months of leave. And all these are predicated on biology, but they become liabilities to the system because you're not looked at fully. So I'm concerned, but yet at the same time, I understand what you're saying.
I want to just say, we can look at it there's another way of looking at it, which is that by virtue of biology itself, I'm going to need to take time off to give birth. That's a fact. And we can actually use that biology to now start thinking of what it is that needs to be done to ensure that in my time away, taking care of this baby, because I am going to have a baby, because biologically I'm designed that way, I'm going to need to take time off. What is it that we can do to ensure that the fact that I'm a woman who needs to take time off is not going to disadvantage me? So it's important that we also think about it in that sense, in the sense that we should not just look at it as something that works against us, but something that needs to be put on the table, something that we need to engage on at the policy level to ensure that the fact that I'm a woman does not work against me, and that there are certain things that I'm going to experience that should not necessarily disadvantage me. And this also speaks to the issue that we spoke about earlier about Naledi Chira having to take care of her child. I mean, socially, I think it's just important that we acknowledge that there are differences and that we still just need to work on what it is that we can do to ensure that this is not used against us. But I do hear you.
Thank you so much for that conversation. It is a very important conversation, especially around the essentialization of our biologicalness. Because for the longest time in the history of the workspace, women have been marginalized solely based on that, to say they are going to take time out. So that justified the gender pay gap that still exists apparently to date, by the way, within different spaces where women are viewed as liabilities within these spaces. And it still happens in some other institutions of higher learning where you are told that you are coming in, but you should make sure that you do not fall pregnant within the first year. Of your employment term, and it happens in so many subtle, but also in other spaces in overt ways. And it's so unfortunate that that is then used against the women to also, purport the idea that they are weak and they cannot take some of these challenging duties. And then you ask, when someone says women are not true leaders, and then you're looking at the country is collapsing, most of the institutions, the world is in chaos, wars all over, and these are still men, sitting in these positions. But I like the idea of intersectionality that you were bringing, Dr. Mooketsane, around, our different experiences and the multi-layeredness of those experiences in terms of what it means when we navigate these spaces, even political leadership spaces and any other spaces of leadership for that matter. But I would love to throw the question of gender-based violence to you, Prof. LenkaBula. As South Africa, we are a femicide nation. Globally, we've been declared, and we hear these cases day in, day out. And this is not to say that maybe some other countries are not experiencing it. Maybe it's, and it's also not to claim that this is a new phenomenon, but just to say maybe the gaze of the media is shifted to focus on this pandemic that we are facing. So, in light of that, what can the upcoming elections do about that? Whoever gets an opportunity from the 29th, and I'm asking this question from a perspective of what can be done, because in most cases we are accused, especially as feminists, of framing problems and not providing solutions. But we've been saying we cannot provide solutions without resources. So, what is your take on that topic around gender-based violence?
I think maybe I shouldn't think. I should state it's a fact that gender-based violence and femicide are very prevalent in our society, here in South Africa, but also in the world. If we look at the sexual harassment, sexual violence cases here in South Africa, it's across the demographics. All the demographics of South Africa have cases of sexual harassment, gender-based violence, and it's quite prevalent. I serve as the chair of the National Task Team on gender-based violence and femicide in the country, where all the post-school education institutions converge, as well as the SAP and other justice systems. It is very sad to say that even in our universities, gender-based violence is quite persistent, it's prevalent, and many of the institutions do not have policies. The tendency is to blame those who are raped or who are violated. It's also about their clothing. It's also around the use of their biology and such odd reasoning around why gender-based violence is becoming so prevalent. But I think we must learn from history. I think in all countries where there were wars or where there were regimes such as the apartheid regime, when violence stops in the structural systems, it often expresses themselves. It often expresses itself in the family, in the homes, in the macro systems. And I think what we need to be paying attention to is all the political parties, all of them, including the ANC and others, have not really, as much as they've put this as an important imperative, it seems to me we have not put legislative systems or supporting legislative systems or structures that enable us to overcome gender-based violence and femicide. We still treat it as a macro issue, despite of the fact that the numbers of women and men who are seen to being effeminate are increasing around these violent systems. We're also still addressing gender-based violence just as a social and behavioral phenomenon, not the power disparity that feminist scholars such as Dorothy Sole remind us around the master-servant or the hierarchy, the patriarchal hierarchy of men, women, and over. And I think to address some of these aspects, they require radical shift in our policy systems, in our justice systems, because sometimes the justice system is itself a liability and very regressive and very technical without understanding the questions of trauma, of psychology, of also this idea of death through gender-based violence. And therefore, I think it's something that we should pay attention. I've been watching and following the electioneering processes in Namibia. I've actually been quite appreciative when they talk about Netombo from SWAPO. The idea is not about her just coming as a woman leader, but it's about also coming as a leader who was in the forefront of fighting for the liberation of Namibia. It is about Netombo as somebody who has the political experience from ground to the different political seats within SWAPO, but also within government. And I think we in South Africa can learn from these experiences in our neighbor countries or even in the continent or elsewhere, because they then give us a glimpse. And I think their motto is "the future is female." I may not think so. I may think maybe it could have been put differently. But imagine a young girl in primary school who lives in a patriarchal context, who is inspired by the electioneering motto that the future is female. That is an injunction, an invitation to participate, not just to represent, to participate, to look at education, to look at policies, to look at laws. And I think maybe as South Africans, we can also learn from some of these comparative studies on how other countries are dealing with the gender questions, with participation, with representation, but also with creating opportunities for experience, for participation, for failing, and for relifting oneself if you're a woman, or if you're a gay or lesbian or bisexual political participant or political leader. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Prof. And before I throw the conversation back to the room, I want to come to you, Dr. Murisa, and I'm also going to come to you, Dr. Mooketsane, before we engage the audience. But to you, Dr. Murisa, you know, there's been this phrase, men are trash, hashtag men are trash. And I'm deliberately putting you here on the spot as a man, because the response that we got from that, the backlash, actually not the response, was to say not all men. Okay. And sometimes I throw it in my classroom when I'm teaching, and these are people who are occupying strategic positions in society, of leadership in sections of society that matter, and they will insist that not men. But I think the conversation that we've tried to make within that space is to say, not all men is not necessarily an attack, but it's a clarion call for solidarity, but not only just to say, I see you, I hear you. What are you doing? I put it sometimes in simple terms that when your friend is catcalling, a high school kid, and they're saying, what does it mean to you if you're not calling them out? And we are saying that very expression is the same phrase that says men are trash. What is your participation? What is your role in society as we are battling gender-based violence, not only amongst women and young girls, because sometimes we sit in front of our communities, in front of our TVs, and then we see a gay man, and then the whole house say, yay, Nancy Murphy. What does that even mean for us when we claim to say we are transformative, we are fighting for equality, yet we sit in these spaces comfortable and not trying to educate even from our own backyards? Thank you.
Wow. So maybe I subscribe to the not all men are trash. Yeah, but I think, I subscribe to the radical feminist politics. And I always get into feminist spaces, and I declare myself that way. Being raised in a family where there are only 2 boys and there are 4 girls, and only having daughters, so understanding all that. But I think, let me start off with a story, a powerful story around advocacy. In Zimbabwe, if there are 2 criminals, one has been involved in cattle rustling and is caught, they're most likely going to spend at least 20 years or 15 years in prison. And another criminal is accused of rape. They're most likely going to get away with 3.5 years. I think when we look at that, this is not a post-colonial practice. It started off during the colonial times. It is the power of interests and the interests that are represented. So the cattle-owning agrarian class, he had more power in terms of advocating for its interests and pushing for laws that are punitive in that space. While it's the women's movement, no matter how abominable or how abhorrent it is that we begin to see increasing cases of rape, the charges have always been tempered. They've always been like this. So I want to take us back to this conversation around representation and participation, and to begin to understand the power behind lawmaking. Because this is what Prof is talking about, to say it's no longer just about saluting women, but it's about saying what kind of laws do we want? We're in an election season. We're looking for a political party that can align with the feminist agenda, which is transformative. So what kind of laws do we want in South Africa to make sure that we deal with this vice? So I think for us is to understand the different interests at play, because the gender-based violence that we're talking about is a construct within patriarchy. And when you're looking at patriarchy in a context like South Africa and many other post-settler economies, where what you have done is, and this is not in defense to the all men are trash, but what you have is a system whereby we're saying patriarchy understood as a pattern of accumulation, informing the pattern of accumulation, capitalism. If you look at your economy and you understand the role of men and their dominance in that system, then you also understand poverty and how it subjugates a certain demography of men in this country, and the violence it unleashes towards them and their outlet through gender-based violence. So you begin to realize that this work is not easy. There's a bigger task ahead of us, because we may come up to say, let's fix the laws, let's call men trash, etc., but we're still not getting to the root of the problem. So in public policy, we call these wicked problems, because half the time we may be discussing symptoms, because we really have structural issues that are explaining the levels of violence in this country compared to other countries. So you go back now and you look at the levels of how capitalism has penetrated South Africa as a society compared to other countries that do not have the same levels of capitalist activity. And you begin to understand gender-based violence from that perspective. Then you realize how toxic a patriarchal system, a capitalist framework that is influenced by patriarchy. So you come back to feminism and say, how do we address the systems of accumulation, redistribution, and welfare? Because this is where violence is actually taking place. Violence takes place at the top of society, where the powerful men want to demonstrate their power, and it also takes at the bottom of the pyramid, where the man who has been reduced of all dignity, his last outlet is either against his daughter, his wife, etc. But all of it based on a system of violence that robs you of any sense of dignity. So yes, let's pursue the laws, but my argument is that it is a short-term measure in the absence of reforming the dominant system that we live under.
Thank you so much for that, Doc. And
you're right. Sorry, you're right, because coming from colonialism and apartheid, you're right. There's an African-American scholar, I was just forgetting, the theologian, who says we also think about gender from a perspective of men and women, but we forget that in the global capitalist system, the men, for instance, in the continent of Africa, in the global supply chains and distribution, are gendered and trampled upon. And I think what Tendai is saying begs the question, do we even think around these hierarchies and gradations that have been created that allow the profit motive or the neoliberal or liberal systems to shape how we interact with one another? Or are we going to, as we think about elections and consolidating our democracy, are we thinking just about these matters as macro systems where South Africa is autonomous from the global supply chains, or even where Namibia or your country, Botswana, is also going through elections, and the diamonds and whatever, which are not, we don't have diamonds, but we produce the largest diamonds. I'm just saying these are quite critical questions that we have to ask, because we cannot talk about gender as though African men, black men in here, are the decision makers of the distribution of our economy. Whether you think about biotic or mineral resources, if you ask the question, who holds power? Who holds these resources? Who decides how these minerals, whether platinum, uranium, or diamonds or whatever, where do they go? I'm sure even the 20 men in here or 10 men in here might not have even seen how the 10 minerals that are produced in the country, we've not even touched them, precisely because we are alienated from these distributive resources. That Tendai makes a point that we need not just think around these bifurcations and binaries without locating them in the structural systems that aid women and men to participating constructively. I know that my example might be crude, and maybe you, the black men who are sitting there, you're thinking, what is she talking about? But the truth is, we are not even in charge of the economies that we should be in charge of. And therefore, that is an example of gender, because gender is not just, that's why class is still an important discussion for us as social scientists. We now stop talking about class. It has become one of the areas that we are fearful to raising, because we are seen as though we are backward. And I think people like Samia Amin, people like Bayo, and others, whether you think about Georgie, all of them have really said, pay attention. It is one thing to be concerned about identity politics of women, gender, LGBTQIA. It is another to look at how these assets or liabilities are distributed and how participation and representation is manifest. So I was quite provoked by and excited by his input in that regard. Thank you.
I was equally provoked, but in a different way. To me, it sounded like here's a man speaking like a man, talking about a disempowered man. I mean, let me maybe look at it now as a woman. You know, until we look at the social position of women within the home, before we even look at it largely at a national level, the way power is skewed towards men, the way resources are skewed towards men, the way privilege within the home, before we even talk about it at a national level, the way privilege is skewed towards men is the reason why ultimately we have gender-based violence. And I think for me personally, I think it's important, even for the political parties themselves, to look at the position of women, right? And we shouldn't be talking about just unemployment or just poverty. We should be looking at feminization of poverty. We should disaggregate the data. And when we say unemployment, how does it affect men and women? You know, and obviously it affects men and women differently. And those are the things that I think are lost in the nuances, and I think are lost when we now look at it broadly at state level. And of course, what we see at state level is a reflection of what happens at the domestic level. So I think it's quite important for us to, address gender and poverty, address the social and political status of women within the home. And perhaps maybe what we need to be talking about now is how do we empower women to give them a level of autonomy and independence that would in a way free them from violent and abusive positions or situations in the domestic space. And then maybe look at it broadly within the work environment, within parliament, within economic decision-making spaces. Thank you.
So, so the most interesting thing for me here is the structural analysis of gender-based violence, femicide, and structural violence in general. And I think my biggest takeaway from the conversation is that we are doing a broader analysis, of gender-based violence and what it means, even moving to socio-political and economic structures that govern society. But also my biggest worry is that for the longest time, feminists have been saying the challenge of feminism or of being a feminist activist is that when you throw out the word feminist, people are thinking of men hate women. And it is exactly this conversation that's going here to say, is it the right way to fight the systemic injustices to say, as men, we are also struggling? And because for the longest time, our men haven't been coming on board as allies to this fight, because I think for some reason they haven't been aware in terms of how they're also structurally affected, by all these socio-economic and political structures within the space. And when we are saying, let's come together, and form allyship and see how we fight the intensification of neoliberalism within these spaces. Instead of coming together, we've been seeing that violence. And I know Pumlakola has written a lot around the whole issue of projecting your poverty, your indignity, your dehumanization on women. And at the same time, we're saying women are not your enemies. Women are not the enemies of men. And what we are trying to do is to say, how can we come together collectively, see and find ways in which we can influence the space and fight these structures of injustices that are prevailing within that space. But I'm gonna open up the conversation to the broader house before we move to our last sessions to engage. So we're taking questions from the floor, whether they are directed to all the panelists or, yeah. 1, 2, 3. So I'm seeing 3 hands so far. So we're going to take, 4. So we're going to take 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Here, or am I the only one? Sorry? Is it chilly?
It's a bit chilly, yes.
The weather has gone south. Oh, sorry.
Is it
Yeah,
cold?
it's a bit. Whoever is dealing with the weather.
Should I shoot straight?
Yeah.
All right. No, thank you very much, Program Director. And it's a pleasure really to be in this session, to listen to some of our women raising very serious issues around issues of women's position in society, but within the political space as well. Just to shoot straight into my questions, the first one is around perhaps, what do you think are still some of the institutional barriers that women in particular face in politics, given that our country, especially since 1994, has had some of the institutions responsible for advocating for women, such as the Commission for Gender Equality and some of the other directorates within government departments that are solely responsible for gender mainstreaming and addressing issues of persons with special needs, right? And perhaps do you think equality is the right way to go, or should we move towards equity, or rather social justice, And linked to that, I also want to check your view, any of the panelists, around issues of voter bias. How do we address that, given that the bulk of people who vote in our country is at mostly women, and especially women within rural areas? And we know around our women, perhaps I may be insensitive, but women in rural areas view perhaps issues of leadership from a patriarchal perspective, you know, right? How do we address that voter bias? Because the majority of persons who vote are women, and especially women in rural areas. Hence the ANC keeps winning. Thanks.
Good morning, afternoon. My name is Chiedza Chaguta. I work for Hlanganisa Community Fund for Social and Gender Justice. I'm also a student at the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment. And I have both a comment and a question, what might be, I guess, a bit of a lengthy comment and a question following that. So I think, you know, if we reflect on the fact that we've gone into 30 years into democracy as a country, I think for me one of the most important objectives of the democracy project is really strengthened institutions, you know, through accountability and transparency. And I think for me, the fact that we are talking about gender in the elections, in the upcoming elections, speaks to how gender is an important framework or an important lens with which to hold institutions and leaders to account. And so if we say that gender is a framework or is a lens through which we hold institutions to account, I want us to perhaps look at the manifestos, the election manifestos that the different political parties have put out there. As an organization, we undertook an exercise to analyze, well, not analyze, but carry out a gender analysis of those election manifestos based on what the manifesto was saying, not based on historically what the party has done or what they've said or how they're electioneering. And I think there's a lot that, as you know, as academics, as practitioners that are doing social impact work, as you know, leaders in the different sectors, there's a lot that we can do or invest in, you know, the kind of documents. And some of the panelists were talking about how important it is to have policies and whatnot that's on paper. And the colleague has just spoken about rural women. And a big part of what political parties are using to campaign is those election manifestos. And if I was to just ask a question in the audience, both online and here, how many of us have read at least 2 election manifestos? Okay, the hands are still coming too. I think there's a lot that we need to invest ourselves in what has already been provided for. So we are voting a party into power, but we don't know what they've said in their manifesto. So we analyzed the top 5 based on the 2019 election, and we're using a framework really to look at 5 areas around gender equality and social inclusion. The first one was around gender sensitivity, the kind of language that's being used in those manifestos. So are they recognizing, you know, the gendered nature of South Africans? And so it's homework. So you go and check how gender sensitive those manifestos were. The second issue is looking at the issue of political participation, and both from a leadership perspective, but also from the voter perspective. So are political parties taking that into account? And again, I think there was some it's very interesting when you look at it from that lens. The third one is around legislative priorities, that parties are saying their legislative priorities. Are any of those gendered in terms of what they are considering to be priorities? The fourth one really looks at socioeconomic inclusion, and and the kind of issues that we should be prioritizing or could be prioritizing when we look at, when in the context of women. And I think there, again, there's quite a lot of interesting things. And then the last thing is around services, and Dr. Murisa did refer to the issue of services that are critical to women. All the political parties were talking about the energy crisis, but how they saw the energy crisis, is that gendered in nature? When you talk about climate action, what about climate action and how does that affect women? You talk about education, you talk about housing. Actually, only one of the political parties only spoke about housing. So, yeah. So I just want to, so there's a lot I think that's on paper. And I guess my question to the panelists is, how can we get citizens to engage more with manifestos? Because I think they're an important way of judging whether they're a worthy party for me to vote for.
Thank you to the panelists. My name is Karen Abrams. I'm here from the school. I have a comment and a question. The comment is something that troubles me a little bit about the kind of last conversation that we had. So on the one hand, we're saying that the issue is structural. And on the other hand, we're saying that women don't own the mines. And if it's about structure, then it's about ownership and power over resources. But in the most crude kind of idea of identity redress, it's just replacing one identity within the kinds of systems that still exist. The systems that dispossess the majority and who those systems that subjugate women and those less vulnerable at a systemic level. So, to me, there's the kind of contradiction. On the one hand, we want systemic change. On the other hand, we want just representative politics. So I wonder what you'd say about that. And the second question is to Dr. Sadie. Your doctorate was about this idea of how women enter political races, and how women become leaders in political entities. And so it's a question about whether you think kind of that party politics is also part of the systemic challenges that need to change, because it's about women in leadership through or beyond the political party, and how does the kind of party politics inhibit substantive inclusion?
Thank you very much to the panelists for. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for a very rich conversation, which my immediate instinct tells me will need to be carried further and deeper. We would need a dedicated conference. Maybe in the post-electoral context, where we see what the map of parliament looks like, in order to take some of the issues that have arisen further. But perhaps to latch on to Karen's observation about what seems to be a tension in the panel between structuralists like Tendai and, for want of a better label, reluctant postmodernists like like Sadie Mooketsane. And I'm wondering if one way in which we can revisit the debate on difference is to perhaps ask ourselves, how can difference be recognized without necessarily being reproduced in a relationship of power and the cultures of power and stereotypes around it that effectively keep the objects of difference in their place. You see my point? Because, I mean, I first engaged with the literature on difference in the context of our studies on identity politics and of the failures of post-independence nation building, which was criticized as being homogenizing and not sufficiently recognizing difference. Now, in doing that, you then find a situation in which we so overemphasize difference that at the end of the day, it almost becomes a counterproductive exercise in its own right, without necessarily producing that transformation which you are calling for, built around a realistic starting point. And I am comfortable with your suggestion that we should have a realistic starting point. If I take the your argument around biology, in that sense, that have a realistic starting point. But something has to be added to the equation, it seems to me, in order for that starting point not to become a dead end at the end of the day. And that's the question which I wanted to put to you.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any other question?
I'm going first. No. I could, but
I can go first.
she's-
Let's go first.
Oh, you want to take a question?
Sorry, I think
Yes.
we had
Yeah, I
one
think
last
she
hand
wants to ask a question. Yes.
there. Yeah. Sorry, we take those and then we come back to the panel. Thanks.
I just wanted to quickly touch on the issue of party manifestos. Although they may be gender sensitive, the fact that the party leaders and their second in commands are not a woman is still questionable. And it really makes me think that no one is ready to share power with women yet.
Mm. I do agree with you, with the last speaker, that it looks like perhaps the leaders are not yet ready to share power yet. But of course, I mean, no one is ever ready to share power. Even if I had the power as a woman, I don't think I would want to share it with anyone. So I think it's also important, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I think it's also important to really acknowledge that power as it is in its nature will never be readily given. So I think it is the women themselves who must rise and take the power, challenging and difficult as it may be. I think that's the only way that we are going to get the power as women. But it's quite unfortunate then, in the same vein, that we've seen a wane in the women's movement across the continent, really. That strong women's movement that we had in the 90s is nowhere to be found. And I think that's one of the issues that we perhaps need to ponder on. Where are the women? What are the women doing? We can engage all day on what needs to be done. We can change laws, but the women themselves also have a role to play in terms of getting that power, or in terms of driving their own struggle towards gender equality. I'd like to respond to Dr. Abrahams on the issue of political parties. I think political parties themselves are central to representation of women in politics. They are the ground where decisions are made. They are the power battle. And it is the same political parties that seem to be deterring representation of women if we look at it strictly speaking. Through women's wings. Sometimes I say to people, you know, these women's wings seem to me like we are now relegating the issue of gender equality, women's issues to women themselves, yet we don't give them requisite power for them to act on whatever decisions they make or relating to those women issues. So I think women wings themselves are a challenge. In fact, half the time they serve and represent the interests of men more than those of women, which I think is problematic. There was also an issue of manifestos. Yes, someone spoke about manifestos. And it took me back to, you know, thinking and wondering what voting intentions really in this country look like. When we do vote, if half of this room have not read the manifestos, but half of this room are registered to vote, what informs their decisions when they vote? And perhaps this is what gives the political parties a room not to consider gender issues when they draft the manifestos, not to consider the language that they use in drafting these manifestos, and not to really consider the implications on the different genders in terms of the policy issues and policy positions that they take.
So I want to respond to you, Bayo. I think women and feminists or womanists or those who affirm Bosadi theorization have constantly projected a realistic start. This concept or this idea that the personal is political has always been what has sought to weave our personal experiences, whether our lived experiences within the home, our ideas and knowledge that we acquire within institutions, whether it's schools, universities, or our experiences of governments or political parties. Those are the feminist question has sought to answer this. And therefore, it is my responsibility and here to engage, because a lot of time for us as feminist scholars, we emphasize the micro, but the micro systems are not necessarily responding to the structural systems that actually create a large or expansive prejudicial, if not racist, if not sexist, or even violent systems of dispossession. So we need as scholars to overcome this particular problem of choosing and compartmentalizing the varied iterations of what is the problem, what do we seek to understand and to assert. The second question that I think you have raised about this, not just the realistic start, but the whole question of difference. If you in philosophy you've done Derrida, you've done, is it Fatoumata in Senegal? The French feminists. They have wrestled with this aspect of creating bifurcations or even institutionalizing difference to the extent that it disallows us to looking at the moving beyond the difference. And therefore, I think it's an area that we need to understand, because difference is important in as far as we're trying to locate and to transform what dehumanizes, what undermines the participation and the representation, what creates disempowerment, and what limits the viability or feasibility of informing some of these structural systems. So I think we need, as you say, that conference that seeks to ensure that these things are overcome. You referred to Pumla, and you said Pumla, she was here at Wits, I don't know how many Wits know her work, but I think I'm very proud of her work. I think it's very important in a context where gender-based violence and femicide are so established that we have those sites where women themselves or men can think about these things. But I think we would be losing value when we think about us and them, when we don't create a locus for a dialogical or pluriversal conversation on those aspects that we as women, or we as women who are located at the bottom, or even in the hierarchy of women, if you think about in the context of South Africa, how white women, women of Indian descent or Chinese descent, women of mixed descent, and then black women. These hierarchies are not just things we talk about. They're real. They express themselves whether you are buying a house or you're not buying it, or whether you have food or not food. So we have to deepen those instead of creating these compartments that sometimes obfuscates the substantive issue. So I want to then say, la différence as the feminist, I learned this from my sisters in Senegal, who really ask to say there is a great balance that we always have to agitate for, lest difference then becomes that which limits us from overcoming the barriers. I unlike, I think you're too gentle.
Okay.
Yes. Women have never really, we participate in these structural systems. We do. And sometimes some of us internalize the racism. We project the white women. Sorry, the two who are here. It's the first time you're a minority. But in terms of the distribution of land, you're a majority. I'm just giving an example. It's a conversation. I'm inviting you to this conversation. It's very important because if we don't pay attention to that, we will constantly forget that apartheid decimated the black man. And we will then get into a discourse that perhaps we have to engage with Puleng and others, that already says these men, and I made a very crude example, who don't own, and you're saying we want to repeat the capitalist system. No, who don't own the biotic resources of the land, who don't have assets in terms of cows, if I were to use cows as an example, who are used as fodder for a chattel slavery-like economic system that is neoliberal. And then we then want to extricate ourselves from them instead of creating a powerful conversation and a powerful bloc that would like to overcome these problems. And on the manifestos, we've read the manifestos, but I leave that to the experts. But I also think when I look at your 5 criteria, I get worked out because it makes it as though these political party leaders themselves are taking decisions that harness political systems in our country and in the world. That Amazon has more equity than South Africa as a transnational company. It's a critical question that we should ask. Do even these manifestos mean anything if the economic elites or the financial elites, the 8% of the financial elites in the world have more than countries themselves who are making these decisions? Are political parties even themselves at the center, or are they just tools for, or the driving force to consolidating the profit system or the greed system? And for me, I think our discussions around the quality of democracy will do well if this question that Bayo and Keneilwe and Tendai and my facilitator, Dr. Ndlovu, are raising. When the macro, the meso, and the micro find some points of convergence, even of contestations. Secondly, when political parties are not seen as separate institutions to the challenges or the opportunities within their societies. But two, the place of utopia is also important. We're not saying we should recreate a violent capitalist system that he's referring to, but we are saying perhaps the heterogeneous systems that take the best of both and that empower societies and human beings to live with dignity. That would be a type of democracy that distributes services, that allows participation, and that allows us as women to claiming our place. And many of us as women, even if we are not included, we are subversive. We find ways to include ourselves, and we find ways to transforming systems. So I think the agency of women must also be accounted for. The 1956 story is an example in point. They were not included, but they worked and they agitated. Two, men must be our allies. If we think about the leader of, is it Mali, or Burkina, who wrote more profound sayings around the place of women in Sankara, in education, in leadership, in transforming society. So I'm not willing to throw the men in the dustbin. Neither am I willing to allow them to trample upon us. Sure. I want them to rethink their grammar, their logics, and their praxis. And in the manifestation, in the manifestos, in the political systems, and even in holding accountability, the structural systems of financial institutions in the global arena that shape our democracy negatively in most instances. And Bayo's work attests to that. Thank you.
Wow. How does one speak after that? But I think South Africa is safe, or UNISA is safe. Yeah, but I think there's a rhetorical question that you asked. You said, where are the women? I think we need to understand the moment. I think from what we are picking up, the studies that we're carrying out, I think we're actually seeing a resurgence of feminist politics and a consensus around that, with its intersections around agroecology, responding to different challenges, even GBV, etc. And even a shift in the way in which philanthropic resources are structured towards. So in Africa alone, in the past 2 years, we've seen 3 or 4 Pan-African funds focused on promoting feminism, focused on addressing feminist struggles. So I think there is a moment, and so that's at the, is that the meso level? That's at the top, yeah? But what we're seeing on the ground, if you really go on the ground, I think the hope for democracy and the hope for many African countries are actually the agitations, the organizing of women's organizations. The women's movement may have gone underground, but it has not disappeared. Yeah. I find that it is still the most vibrant. It is at the front of many issues. It struggles with all the issues we're raising. It has to bear through patriarchy. It has to bear through collapsing governments. It has to bear through corruption. It has to bear through co-optation, the capture by elites. So I think that's an important moment for us to understand. Then secondly, this issue around manifesto analysis. And I think it's a hook into a certain conversation. I totally agree that political parties and even African governments, their level of autonomy in terms of policy making compared to their counterparts, if we can call them counterparts in the global north, is very limited. They do not have the same power as multinationals and as other multinational or multilateral agencies. But for the kind of conversations that we need, it helps us to do the manifesto analysis. So I'll give you a story. In 2018, leading to the 2018 elections in Zimbabwe, we actually did exactly what you did in this room, but through a survey. We wanted to know the number of people who have actually read a manifesto. We wanted to know that if you have not read the manifesto, on what basis then are you going to make the decision on who to vote for? And it speaks to his issue around power in the rural areas, patriarchy, and how liberation movements keep on retaining the rural vote. So that's very important for us to understand that political behavior in Africa is not necessarily issues-driven the way we look at it. Our politics is still highly personalized. It still goes into the area of the charismatic. It still goes into the area of history and at times historical fears. Some people vote because they do not want a repeat of violence. So they'll vote even for a party they do not agree with because of the threat of violence. But also the history of liberation itself holds true. So the role that is played by political party manifestos, for us, when we're looking at it, is very limited, but it helps in the kind of things that organizations or schools like the School of Governance then go on to do with a political party manifesto that say wins. And then you begin to say, we want to hold them accountable on those 5 principles that you mentioned. To what extent are you going to track all the political party that wins, say, in a province, in a rural in a district, the country? To what extent are you going to hold that? So that by the time we have the next election in South Africa, we have a scoring on the basis of how they perform. Because the challenge with manifestos by their nature, they assume a clean slate that we're starting again. So we're not having a conversation about previous performance. We're now judging them on the basis of a manifesto. So all these are issues that come into play in terms of how you then utilize what you're analyzing and how you actually begin to have conversations with communities. Because at some point, we may vote for a political party that has no interest in the issues that we are advocating for. Then we are expecting them to actually move the needle on those issues, but they never raise them as an agenda in the first place. So I think it's very important for us to do that kind of analysis. So it's a good point to start, to say how do we move on with the conversation. And finally, Professor Bayo, yes, we'll welcome another conference. But I think let's connect countries, because I think these issues are germane in Nigeria, in Ghana, and also other countries that are going to have elections this year. So it would be good for us to have a sort of a multi-country sort of analysis of what would have happened and how we are moving forward.
And in addition to that conference, Prof. Bayo, I'm also proposing a special issue, an edited volume around the conversation. And before we go back to the floor, just to weave the conversation and bring it back, and this time forward-looking. But before I do that, I ask my next questions. I just want to reflect very briefly on the identity difference. And as a student of social movements over time, I think the issue of identity politics is something that has stayed constant over time. And if you reflect, and I'm just going to pick 2 examples from the Black Consciousness movement and the Fees Must Fall movement, I think our starting point has to do with the acknowledgement of the existence of differences within these movements. So of course we do have, a collective agenda, a collective endpoint during the apartheid, the Black Conscious movement, was looking at the issue of race and how they can transform those spaces. But without acknowledging the existence of the difference that exists within that broader movement, then it's very difficult to have a conversation that transcends identity if we are not acknowledging the other. And also during Fees Must Fall movement, the biggest downfall of the Fees Must Fall movement was the refusal to acknowledge and to accept the existence of the differences that exist within the movement, as if we experience these spaces in the same way. And the concept of intersectionality really becomes very useful if we're to think about a way forward to say, as a starting point, how do we collectively, agree that we are affected by the fees, but they affect us differently as we have these differences, and then how do we then work towards overcoming? Because I guess the idea, even the post-2000 community movements, they were not necessarily looking at, because you cannot transform a system at once, you do it step by step. but where are we starting? What are the gains that we are prepared to take, no matter how small they are, but what are the concessions that we're supposed, to make, so that at least we find a collective common ground to transcend that politics of difference. But this is coming to you, Dr. Murisa, around the question of civil society organizations in terms of how they can effectively influence the national agenda on gender equality and ensure that gender issues are prioritized in spaces like these, like the 2024 national elections in South Africa, but also beyond. But also maybe if you could share with us, because I'm trying to have a forward-looking perspective in terms, we've been criticized of, we frame problems, but there are no lessons they believe there are no lessons to learn from. So maybe what are other successful models of advocacy and activism that you think they can be scaled or adapted from other regions, for instance, or maybe from some of your experiences within the space that we can incorporate moving forward? Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think one thing that we, at times in meetings like this, is we underestimate or we overlook the history and the successes. The fact that we have a SADC protocol on gender is actually a result of a lot of work carried out by civil society organizations. And I think even here in South Africa, we have the Women's Caucus in terms of women parliamentarians exchanging notes with their colleagues across the SADC region and holding the space. So I think it's something to celebrate as a victory, to say that we have a consensus around making sure that we increase the representation of women. I know there's a challenge around representation, but it's a starting point. So if South Africa is getting to 42% women's representation, that's a huge issue. And it's actually a result of a lot of advocacy carried out by civil society. But there's also the tension in the fact that if you look at historically, I think we moved to a numbers game. For us in agriculture, we moved towards, we want 10% of our budgets. For those in health, we want 15%. And so we then tick the boxes to say, oh, governments are now allocating so much. But I don't think we bothered with the practice. We bothered with the questions of quality. So for instance, the fact that we have women in parliament, how is it actually transforming society? How is it relating to the issues that we've already been discussing around sort of the changes that we want? So proposals that are being made, for instance, what Chiedza is talking about in your organization, it's actually helping us to begin to say, maybe we need to shift the levers of advocacy and move towards maybe accountability. A new accountability movement to say we have SDGs as a framework. We have Agenda 2063. By the way, we should all celebrate Nkosazana Zuma, because Agenda 2063, I'm surprised that you said that there's little traction in South Africa. For some of us who have worked with her at a Pan-African level, we know the kind of stuff that she left for us and the stuff that we're using at that level. So we have those frameworks, and those frameworks do not come on their own. They are a result of a lot of intense advocacy. We have the Africa Mining Vision, which is very clear about how women can also participate in mining. So all these are frameworks, guidelines that we have. The test for Africa is practice. So we have not made a huge movement around actually fixing some of these issues in terms of making sure that, number one, policies are domesticated from regional guidelines into actual policies. We've also not made a serious commitment to saying that how do we actually advance people-to-people solidarity, especially amongst women, because we don't see the challenges of women in South Africa being translated into advocacy issues outside of South Africa. So, for instance, I'm part of, I work with a SADC focused, or now a Pan-African focused movement, the Rural Women's Assembly, beginning to connect rural struggles, to begin to realize that the struggles of women, smallholder women here in South Africa, are similar to the struggles of women in Malawi, are similar to those. So when we begin to connect the dots around the similarity of our struggles and the challenge of the moment, actually we begin to then create synergies and we mobilize voice. So what we have right now is the mobilization of voice. And also the intersection between what you're asking and this preponderance that we're beginning to see in acceptance of feminist politics, an acceptance of that feminism as a lens or as a paradigm in how we then begin to influence certain policy spaces. So now the challenge we have is for some of us who work at a Pan-African level or at a global level to begin to see those issues that we're discussing at those levels translating into practical policy measures in countries like ours around this, given to say that if we have a problem of GBV, how is it connecting with the feminist struggles across the continent? So I think it's an opportune moment that we have recognized and we have realized what needs to be done. And we have won the first part of the battle in terms of getting the protocols right, the guidelines right, the policies are in place. Because policymakers will push back and say, we already have a policy on this, but the challenge now is actually in the practice. So issues like the nascent emerging accountability movement, what is beginning to say, let's count, let's understand this, etc. It becomes very important, but it's a very technical thing that needs to be done for us to really consolidate and build working democracies.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Murisa. And this one is coming to you, Prof. LenkaBula and Dr. Mooketsane, around the role of the higher education space in terms of, transforming as little things as they can look like they are trivial, they are small, but they matter around the language that we use and knowing that the language does actually inform, some of the actions that are being done as spaces of higher education where we produce some of the most homophobes, some of the most misogynists that we are seeing out there. What is the role? What can be the role of the higher education institutions, for pushing towards gender transformation, and also changing the language around how we use the language to disempower the non-heterosexual identifying others and othering them.
Okay. Yeah, I think the emergence of fundamentalisms, whether in church or in society, in political party systems, including in the distribution of resources, is a critical liability for our society and the gains that have been made. We are talking about the charter that have been done in SADC, the changes in the African Union, the commitments to following through on the budgets, but also even on the manifestos of many political parties in South Africa, but also in the region. I really also don't want to think women as women. Was it Carol who said, "What do you mean, we women?" Asking this difficult feminist question. I don't want to say you should put any woman into a position of leadership. I don't want to associate myself with that. Because I've given you an example of Hlengiwe, who appointed a cabinet full of men, who has let go of Mampele Rampele, one of the great scholars and an advocate of black consciousness, a medical doctor, an intellectual, who let go of a young prospective leader, decimated her future, Hlengiwe Zulu, who just has this a bucket full of black people to be used, utilized, and spewed out when it is opportune, who asserts a political system that is indifferent to the liberation gains of this country in the 30 years of liberation. And they burn the flag that represents the social capital and social cohesion that has been gained by the trivial benefits we would have gained from democracy. So if we say women, my question is, which women should lead political parties? It must be conscientious women who are politically astute, who want to empower society, who want to extricate themselves from the violence that we are contending with. And therefore, I'm saying, even as we speak about gender, about transformation, about language, around political systems, we also must have some base criteria that we say would be resourceful, helpful for the, I'm just using that political example, but it's a vivid one. It is a case study that we can learn from. So I think it's very important. But I also experience many women leaders in many political parties who are not yes sir women, who are working with women, and now I don't have a problem with the women's wing, because that's where the political conscientization takes place. Sometimes we may be complicit in the women's wing, but it's a safe space that can become a learning environment where the language discourse can be raised, where the prejudices can be discussed and others empowered. But the idea is, are political parties using these spaces to harness those? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. The types of leaders that we have found, if you look in the ANC, you have a medical doctor now as a treasurer general of the top 7 of the ANC. You have women who are experienced in the political party system, taking leadership and making advances in the areas that we would not have seen. If we learn from the Pan-African Congress, even though it has low numbers, because the issues, the primacy of the African as the locus of articulation of the assets that have to be shared, whether as land or as the future or participation, are also equally important. So I think, colleagues, it is when men and women conscientiously work together, looking at resources of scholarship, intellectual ideas, heterogeneous systems, and build on this to building our country, that we can succeed. I think it is distasteful that all our presidents will go to one country and see one man president of some other countries. These are some of the things that in the elections, as we engage with them towards the last iterations of electioneering, we should also point as the distasteful parts of African leaders who don't see themselves as leaders, but as beggars in the marketplace of the global distribution systems. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think I like the fact that you acknowledge that higher institutions of learning are gendered and gendering, and that inequalities within universities are prevalent, and we can't run away from that. But I think it's also important to look at. I mean, we've seen with at least in the South African case, we've seen students movement that have promoted diversity, that have promoted inclusion, and this tells us that universities themselves are a good grooming ground for political leadership. They're also a good grooming ground for social change, for empowerment for young people. But I think it's also important that the universities themselves are gender sensitive, that the research, the teaching, it takes consideration of gender, right? That we don't produce graduates that are gender insensitive or gender blind. So I think it's also important to perhaps also consider, maybe not necessarily just at higher institutions of higher level, higher institutions of higher learning, but also at a lower level to inculcate within the curriculum the gender perspective, so that we get an appreciation as we rise through the systems of issues of gender and gender equality. And of course, ultimately, when the students graduate from these institutions, they become important members and part of the society. So I think it provides an outlet for us to influence, to empower, and to ensure that we create gender-sensitive systems. Thank you.
So I'm going to come back to the floor. I'm taking the last round of questions. One. Other hand, am I seeing other hands? Okay. No. Okay. All right. I will take that question.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to the panelists and good afternoon, colleagues. So my question is this. We are speaking about gender in the 2024 elections, and I do realize, and I think also the director of the school at the beginning of the series of this panel discussion had highlighted that 2024 is an important year for elections, not only in South Africa, but for countries around the world. In terms of gender, I want to ask a question to any of the panelists who feels comfortable to answer. We see that from the UN Women statistics, right, that women in parliament in sub-Saharan Africa, right, their average is 26.5, which is the world average, But if you look at it very carefully, and the methodology they use instead is that they divide Europe's percentage statistics between adding Europe with Nordic countries, then again going to Europe and subtracting Nordic countries as well, the Scandinavian countries, right? The Sweden, Finland, and Norway. And if you look at that very carefully and you add sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa statistics together as a continent as Africa, you'll find that Africa has more women in parliament than most of these Western countries. To give you an example as well, look at America. They have never had a woman president. African countries have had women presidents. And my question to you is, don't you think in this debate of gender that we're holding during elections, that despite strides that need to be made, Africa is doing very well compared to the so-called Western democratic countries that speak about gender equality and so on and so forth?
Thank you so much for that question. I'm not seeing any more hands in the room, but I'm just going to check if there are any questions from online. Anyone monitoring the online audience, are there any questions or comments for the panel, for the panelists? Okay, so while we... Okay.
In the meantime.
Okay, so in the meantime, while we are checking for those questions, we can have the panelists responding to that question. You can go.
I wasn't going to respond, but I wanted to reflect on what Prof said earlier on appointing women. And I personally wanted to say I think it is encouraging to see that we do have appointments of women in high institutions of learning. And I think it is a good thing. It is sending a positive message to and we are so proud of you. I think it sends a good message. The question was on Africa doing better than the other continents. I think we may be doing better than others, but I don't think it's fair to compare yourself with the West. I think we still do have a long way to go. I think we still need to do more. Of course, I mean, globally, it's a global phenomenon. I mean, it's a challenge everywhere, and it doesn't make it. It doesn't make our poor performance any better. That it's better than that of other regions. I think we still do need to put in the work as Africa and the rest of the globe in the same way.
Okay, I'm thinking there are questions from the online. Dr. Mini, okay.
There is a question by Palesa Mbaza, and she says, thank you for this amazing panel on a very important topic. I often wonder about the electorate. Do women vote along what constitutes women's issues? And if not, then why is that not the case? And if they do, have they been successful thus far? Okay, there is a second question from an anonymous. Thank you for the acknowledgement of the difference between males and females. How do we bridge the gap or find the balance between the following two things? One, wanting to create or empower or facilitate conducive environments for women in society and in different positions. Two, raising or building the next generation of children and youth in a way that gives credit to merit and not just gender, and where boys or men do not end up feeling like they cannot still validly or valuably contribute to society as well.
Okay. Please go, Karen.
From Kaniso, feminism has become too much in this country. We are tired. It's creating imbalance in the economy and households. Puleng asks, why do we only look at women whenever we address gender imbalances? What about men? And what about transgender communities? Are we saying women are our only priority? Free Thinker says we need a female deputy president. From there, we can move from structural gender imbalances. We need a society reform, a whole new point of view so we can tackle GBV and femicide. It's another few questions by Moleboheng. What economic gap are we creating through feminism? I think we need to be exploring a different way to lead and develop strategies for leadership empowerment regardless of gender. Women will take their stand in leading as long as they are already doing.
Okay, thank you so much to the online community for also contributing and being actively in the house with us. So coming back to the panelists, and as you are making your responses, I'm hoping you are using the opportunity, as your closing remarks. But also, in addition to responding to questions, I would love to hear your thinking around multi-stakeholder collaboration towards bridging the gender gap. And here, just to clarify that we are defining gender very broadly beyond women to also include men and also non-binary folks within this conversation and all other, structural definitions that have been used within the space. So I would love to hear your reflections in terms of how do we think about multi-stakeholder collaboration. Thank you.
Should I go? Oh.
Yes.
I just want to say, perhaps it's, how do I put it? I think we, as you say, gender is complex, and we should not fall into the trap of the old gender definitions, and where we talk about just women and men, and we were just giving that important clarification. The second part that I thought is quite important. Within a gay couple, there could be one who is seen to be playing the role of the feminine and one of the masculine in the relationship. Even those relationships looked at the gender lens still distribute power dimensions. So we need not fool ourselves to saying or to obfuscate the fact that the complexity of gender is something that we still need to contend with and to study and to strengthen, even as we speak about. And therefore, I think when we think about the future, even of politics, or of, I don't want to think about politics without thinking about the economy, without thinking around ecological degradation and climatic implications for. So I think we should think about the laws, the policies, the practices that enhance the quality of outputs for our democracy, including being attentive to our nexus in the global arena. I want to say to my brother, your point is very important. I think you have just given us a lesson why anti-colonial lens is very important in our analysis, where the West must not be a lens through which we project our successes or what we want to be, but just a comparative aspect for us to study ourselves and what we want for ourselves. Because if we look at those examples, we cannot render diminutive the efforts that the continent is doing. But I think we can only also succeed when this gender sensitivity is accompanied with conscientization. I think it's quite important. I gave an example of Hlengiwe, but think about the Prime Minister of Tanzania. Was it the President or Prime Minister? President. Who says, who's the leader of the country, but who says women should still bow to their partners? So these are complex. These complexities must be studied, even as we advocate. The last thing I wanted to speak to you, it's one thing to be, it's really a celebration for institutions to appoint women and to break what others may call the glass ceiling. But it's also a very violent exercise, because when that has been done, there are no systems and processes that are enabling, or even policy systems that are enabling for women to articulating their leadership. At UNISA, for instance, unions have said, I should be raped, I should be molested, I should be, or there would be a question, when is she dying? On social media. No, I'm talking. At no point did we think to be a vice chancellor of a university, you have to have security. At no point. But the reality is such that you must be committed not only to rising as yourself, but to representing the social justice issues that women as leaders or minorities or others to working with. And this example of mine, I'm sharing it not to traumatize you or not to re-traumatize myself, but it's a factual reality that even as we go for these elections, even as women like Netumbo is being projected as the future leader of Namibia, we should be asking the questions that my sister asked about the manifestos. Are there structural systems enabling? And if not, how do you empower women to lead and to lead without fear, but conscientious of the transformations required by society? Thank you.
Ndlovu? Okay. Well, on the issue of collaboration, I think, of course, we can consider the academia, the civil society organizations, and government. And I think it's important that the collaboration, brings together or brings out an integration of knowledge, practice, and of course, advocacy competencies that come with civil society, and that in the process, there's a generation of knowledge that could be used to enhance gender equality, and that the collaborations are strategic in their nature. Yeah, and then in conclusion, I think we cannot consider ourselves, we cannot consider the elections to be free and fair if women continue to be marginalized. If women are marginalized as voters, as candidates, and as part of the electoral management bodies. So I think it is important that we consider the engagement and the participation of women at all levels in the electoral processes. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll keep it short. I see Prof is holding his bag, so you never know. It's the. So I'll just talk about this gender versus meritocracy, the risk. I think first of all is the risk of the binaries we're making. To say when we're talking about gender, we're then juxtaposing it between the girl child and the male child. That is a very, and I actually think, at times the nuances within the gender movement, feminist movement. So I think the first round of this, the feminist movement in the 80s, it was seen as alienating because it was seen as if it was abstracting at a certain level of, academic abstraction, etc. But I think where we are now, we're actually coming to a place whereby this discussion needs to be landed properly. Otherwise, we're again facing the same challenges. In a country like South Africa, surely we cannot say we need to move away from affirmative action, considerations of gender. Surely it's too early to think of that. If the Jews, so many years after the Holocaust, still demand to be treated in a certain way, and South Africans, we just got their independence 30 years ago, you want to say you want to move into a meritocracy where you ignore history. It is very dangerous. So given the hierarchies that Prof talked about earlier, about the hierarchies even of women themselves, where do you put the boy child in those hierarchies? So if we're beginning to say that this is what we're doing. So I think what we really need to understand is the gender movement or the feminist movement is part and parcel of this decolonial movement. It's not separate, but it's part and parcel to say it has to be an all-inclusive movement where we are fighting for certain rights that include the boy child, because the boy child is just as alienated as maybe their counterparts. But there's a history of exploitation, there's a history of patriarchy that we have to undo. So the danger is for us to begin to say, because I identify as a man, therefore I'm outside of the gender movement or the feminist movement. That's where we lose the battle, because we are all in this movement, because it's a movement about rights, it's a movement about inclusion, it's a movement about social justice for all of us. Yeah. I'll stop here, thanks.
I like that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murisa. I know yourself and myself, we've had this conversation around donating time. And I've said I take one drop at a time, because I've said for the longest time, the mic for women has been muted. And when we are muting it, I don't even hesitate to cut your time short so that I can give more time to women who haven't been speaking. And then I said we're doing a global justice system. But thank you again, Prof. LenkaBula, for raising the issue around your experience within the UNISA system. And also, I think this is reflective of other struggles that other women like you have experienced in different spaces. And I've always made this argument to say, I think it's lazy analysis to just argue that when women get to higher positions, they get to sideline other women and they get to forget. And I've said, what have we done, as people are being led by these women who are in leadership, to say, how can we assist you? What kind of support do you need within that space? Because my understanding is that even being that first woman vice chancellor is not easy. It does not come with any privileges at all. Instead, it comes with a lot of struggles. And I've said we need to reflect on the role of women within these leadership spaces and what it means to be in a boardroom that is full of people who have always had a defined agenda. And then you are coming into that room, you are the only person who's carrying the agenda of literally the whole country on your shoulders. And everything gets to be reduced to say, let's vote. And I've said, that's how you realize how stupid you look like, when you are the only person who's voting for something that you think is transformative and all of that, but everyone in the room are happy with maintaining the status quo. And I've said the argument shouldn't even begin with what are women on top they're doing. Should begin with what kind of support do they have within those spaces, and how can we make their experience, better, instead of looking at how they can transform our 100 years of operation in 2 months in office. And thank you so much. Dr. Mooketsane, for highlighting the issue of democracy and the issue of free and fair elections, to say as long as we still have these groups that are marginalized within the systems, the elections will never be fair. And I've asked this question, within several political parties to say, how are you thinking intentionally and deliberately about making sure that we see the next woman president, because it cannot happen to say we are competing freely. And this is coming back to Dr. Murisa's point to say we cannot just ignore, these structural problems that have been happening over time and say all of a sudden we can wake up tomorrow and believe that we are equal. Thank you so much from the audience for engaging us both in the house and online. We are really honored to have you as much as we are honored to have these guests. And to the organizers of this series, Kimantha, Mane, Prof, Bio, and team, we are very humbled for this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to the moderator.
Can we get stand up?
You are a great facilitator. Thank you.
There's refreshments outside for everyone. More than welcome to have some tea and coffee outside.
Hi, how are you?
I was at the Father's Matter conference.
Maybe it was my lookalike. Yes.
Before that, I was in What you said you were from England last time.